The sun sagged low over Willow Valley, its October glow spilling across the lone dirt road like molten gold. Out here in the Montana Territory, the land often felt too wide for its own quiet. Even if the wind seemed to wander miles before it finally found the nerve to rustle the cottonwoods, guarding the small settlement. Most days brought nothing more than wagon wheels, groaning hooves, thudding, and the stray laugh rolling out of Hartley's saloon. But today an uneasy hush stretched across the valley. A military wagon had creaked in at first light, halting behind the sheriff's office where the ground lay packed and unforgiving. The soldiers riding with it looked worn and sharp-eyed, their uniforms powdered with trail dust. What hooked the attention of the townsfolk, though, was the iron-barred cage bolted to the back. Inside sat a man tall and moving silent. They called him Shame, the soldiers said, tossing the name out carelessly. They claimed he was Apache, claimed he'd gotten into a fight with a rancher downstate, claimed he was dangerous. But shouting a thing never made it truth, and Sora Lane had lived long enough to know the West carried more lies than facts on its wind. She stepped out of her herb shop, brushing her apron with peppermint and chamomile, still clinging to her hands. When the noise reached her, she paused. Sora wasn't the type to chase after trouble yet. Something pulled at her chest, an instinct she didn't understand. By the time she reached the square, a loose ring of townsfolk had gathered. Men, a handful of women, a cluster of curious children gripping marbles and scraps of string. They circled the cage, muttering under their breath. "Look at him," a rancher whispered. "Sittin' there like he ain't scared of nothin'." "He ought to be," another said. "They say he snapped a rancher's arm like twine. Bet he'll do worse if you turn your back," someone added. Sora lingered at the edge, her heart stumbling as she finally saw him clearly. Rayn sat cross-legged, hands resting lightly on his knees. Broad shoulders, lean frame, a spine straight as a spear. Every measured breath made him look even larger despite the cramped cage. His dark hair was tied loosely at the nape, a thin braid falling along one side marked with 2 small bone beads. Dust darkened his boots and the hem of his shirt, but nothing about him looked beaten. He sat with a quiet dignity that unsettled the crowd far more than any threat. What stunned Sora first were his eyes. Deep, still watching everything, yet revealing nothing. Eyes like rich earth after heavy rain. She had seen eyes like that once before when she was a lost, terrified girl wandering the foothills. A group of native women had found her, wrapped her in a blanket, offered warm broth, and held her until her father came crashing through the trees. The youngest woman, the one who held Sora's hand the longest, had eyes just like Rayn. That memory flickered through her mind, soft as lamplight. A boy tossed a pebble that clinked against the bars. Rayn didn't move, didn't flinch. His gaze drifted toward the far end of the yard as though listening to something the rest of them couldn't hear. "He ain't right," someone muttered. Sora tightened her jaw. Calm wasn't guilt. It was restraint, strength, endurance. But the crowd wasn't made of people who understood that. Old Eldrick appeared beside her, smelling faintly of river mud and wood smoke. "Folks judge too quick," he murmured. "Seen men guilty as sin shake worse than a spooked horse." That one, he nodded toward the cage. "He's holding something inside. Not anger, not fear. Something else." Sora didn't answer. She couldn't. Something about Rayn, the way he breathed, the way he held himself, stirred a knot of emotion she wasn't ready to name. "Enough staring." Corbin Hall barked suddenly. The sheriff stomped out of his office stomach, straining against his belt mustache, twitching in irritation. "He ain't a showpiece. Move on." A few drifted away, though several lingered. Sora stayed. She didn't know why she remained when her shop still held bundles of lavender, waiting to be hung, and willow bark needing grinding. Yet her feet refused to carry her home. Slowly the noise around the square thinned until only she and the man in the cage remained. A breeze lifted between them, tugging a strand of Rayn's hair. Then he lifted his gaze. His eyes met hers, not sharp, not suspicious, but aware, present, The sensation ran through her like a tremor, as if he were looking past her face and straight into her intention. Sora's breath hitched. There was no fear in him, no defiance, only a quiet recognition, as though he already understood she wasn't there to mock him. For a long moment, neither of them looked away. Then Rayn lowered his gaze again, the moment slipping away like a small wind stirring dry grass. But Sora felt something shift inside her, soft, subtle, certain. Something about the way their eyes met stayed lodged inside her, warm as the memory of that childhood rescue she had almost forgotten. As she turned to walk away, Sora Lane realized she hadn't spoken a single word yet. Her thoughts roared louder than the crowd behind her. This isn't right. He doesn't belong in that cage. A cold breeze swept across her cheek, carrying the sharp scent of pine and far-off snow. It felt like some kind of sign, though she wasn't brave enough to call it that. She headed back toward her shop, her throat tight and her hands unsteady. She didn't know it then, but something quiet and familiar in her life had shifted. The predictable rhythm she'd lived by had begun to bend, and Rayn's world, shadowed solitary, had begun to crack open too, all because of one shared look in the warm light over Willow Valley. The shop bell chimed softly as Sora stepped inside, bringing the last glow of afternoon with her. The scent of dried mint, crushed juniper and yarrow wrapped around her like an old quilt. She had built her days on those fragrances, steady healing grounding, the opposite of what churned in her chest now. She hung her shawl on its peg and moved toward the counter, but her hands shook too much to begin any task. The image of the man in the cage Rayn kept flooding back in. Every time she tried to push it aside, it returned like a tide rolling stubbornly ashore. She planted her palms on the counter and shut her eyes. Life in the valley always followed a sure rhythm. Mornings mixing tonics, afternoons tending her herb garden, evenings reading by lamplight or walking beneath the pines. She liked that quiet life. It steadied her. Yet now something felt different, unsettling in a way she couldn't ignore, like how a deer senses the first breath of winter. A soft knock came at the open door. Eldrick leaned against the frame, his old fishing hat in hand. "You looked real troubled walking off back there," he said. Sora managed a faint smile. "Troubled? Yes, I guess that's the word." Eldrick stepped inside his boots, leaving faint mud prints across her floor. Men like him stir the air different. Folks look at him and see the stories they've been told, not the truth. He paused. "But you saw something else, didn't you?" She hesitated. "I saw a man. Quiet. Someone who didn't look violent at all. Someone who shouldn't be treated like an animal. That's more sense than half this town's shown all year." Sora placed a jar of calendula salve on the counter for him. His hands were always cracked from river water. He accepted it, but his eyes stayed fixed on her, steady and knowing. "You fixin' to do something about that fella?" Sora swallowed. "I don't know." He tipped his hat. "Sometimes the thing that troubles us most is just our heart, nudging us toward what's right." He left her with that thought, and Sora stood in the silence long after he'd gone. Later that evening, she followed the narrow trail behind town toward home. Her little cabin glowed warm through the window. Her garden, her pride stretched neatly behind it. Lavender sneezeweed, St. John's wort, raspberry leaf. She knelt beside the lavender, brushing her fingers across the cool silver leaves. But her mind wasn't here. It drifted back to that cage, to Rayn, to those eyes that had held hers for a single breath. She straightened, breath catching, as the old memory rushed back, herself at 11, lost beneath tall pines, the native women who found her, their careful hands, their gentle songs, the broth they shared, as though she were their own. Why had she buried that memory, and why had seeing Rayn stirred it so fiercely? "Because you owe a kindness," she thought, "and no one here has offered him even a scrap of it." Inside, she lit the lamp and brewed evening tea, though the motions felt empty. Sitting at her small wooden table, she stared into her cup without drinking. A thought began forming soft at first, then stronger. A possibility. A choice. The military would take Rayn away in a day or two. Once he left Willow Valley, his fate wouldn't be in her hands or anyone's. And if the stories of Fort Keating held any truth, he wouldn't see much mercy there. Her throat tightened. She set down her cup, stood, and paced the room. She'd never been impulsive. She wasn't now. She preferred careful choices, measured steps. Yet this felt different. Not reckless. Just right. The next morning, she arrived early at her shop. But she couldn't settle. She moved jars, sorted herbs, counted coins, anything to keep her hands occupied. Still, the decision pressed on her like waves battering a rocky shore. Veil rider, sandy-haired and always half-smiling, as though life existed for his amusement, strolled in. "Morning, Sora," he said brightly. "Got anything for saddle sores?" "In the second drawer," she replied. He rummaged until he found the tin, but instead of heading out, he leaned against the counter with too much ease. "You hear about that Apache fella?" he asked. "Town'll be better off once they haul him out." Sora stiffened. "You don't know what happened. Don't need to. Trouble follows their kind." He shrugged, voice careless. "Wouldn't want you wandering near that jail yard. Might spook you." Sora Lane lifted her chin. It didn't. He blinked, surprised by her steady tone. "Sora." He cleared his throat, trying again. "You're a good woman. Kind. But don't tangle yourself in things that ain't your business." She held his gaze without flinching. "Maybe sometimes it's exactly where we're meant to be." Veil Rider stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. Then he tipped his hat and slipped out the door without another word. Sora watched him leave, her heartbeat quickening, not because of Veil, but because clarity had finally settled inside her, like a stone dropping into still water. She knew now what she had to do. Taking a deep breath, she closed her shop early, gathered the heavy cloth bag holding her savings, and walked straight toward Corbin Hall's office. Each step was both frightening and strangely freeing, because Rayn didn't belong behind those iron bars. Because she owed a kindness the world had long forgotten. Because something inside her whispered her life had been too small until this very moment. And because when she met Rayn's eyes, she'd felt a truth she couldn't explain. She reached the sheriff's door. Her hand didn't tremble as she knocked. Corbin Hall looked up from his desk, his mustache twitching in surprise as Sora stepped inside. He wasn't used to seeing her here. Sora Lane didn't stir, troubled, didn't complain, didn't track dust across his floor. She sold herbs, tended her garden, and had lived quiet as a field mouse. "Miss Lane," he said, leaning back in his creaking chair. "Something wrong?" Sora closed the door behind her, fingers tight around the cloth bag hidden beneath her shawl. The office smelled of cold coffee and the gun oil Corbin used far too often. "I want to talk to you about the Apache man," Sora said. The sheriff raised a brow. "The prisoner. What about him?" Her throat felt tight, but she forced her voice steady. "I understand he's being taken south." "Yeah. Soldiers'll fetch him the day after tomorrow. Fort Keating's request." Corbin waved a hand dismissively. Sora's stomach twisted. Every story she'd ever heard about Fort Keating involved chains, biting cold, and cruelty, disguised as procedure. She stepped closer. "I want to take him instead." Corbin Hall blinked, sat up straighter, then let out a short, startled laugh. "Miss Lane, that ain't funny. I'm not joking." He studied her. Really studied, her eyes narrowing. "You're serious." "I am." He leaned forward, elbows digging into the desk. "You know what folks will say, right? A woman like you, taking an Apache prisoner into her home." "Let them talk," she replied. Corbin scratched his chin, mulling it over. "Even if I agreed, and I ain't saying I do, why would you want him? Word is he assaulted a rancher." "You know the story isn't solid," Sora murmured. "And he deserves more than a cage. Miss Lane," he exhaled heavily. "You're kind. But kindness doesn't change what he might have done. It can change what happens next." Corbin stared at her for a long moment. Then his eyes drifted to the bag under her shawl. You didn't bring what I think you brought. She loosened the knot and placed the cloth bag on his desk. With a soft thud, silver coins and folded bills spilled across the wood, enough to make even Corbin's steady hands pause. This is everything I've saved, Sora said. The law allows residents to hire a prisoner for contracted labor if charges aren't finalized. I want to sign for him. 6 months. Under my care. Corbin rubbed his forehead. You're making this real hard on me. It shouldn't be hard at all, Sora said quietly. Just right. Corbin glanced from her to the money, then toward the window where the cage sat in the yard. Finally, he released a long sigh, the kind that meant the decision was already made. Fine, he muttered. You want him? He's yours. Paperwork's simple enough. He reached for a form and began writing. But don't say I didn't warn you. Men like him don't trust easy. And if he runs, that's on you. I understand, Sora replied. She didn't mention she didn't believe Rayn would run. Something deep inside whispered that he was a man who chose his path with intention, not fear. When the papers were done, Corbin called for Bran to fetch the key. The heavy padlock clanged open, shattering the afternoon stillness. Sora stepped outside as the cage door creaked. Rayn didn't move at first. His eyes lifted, but his posture stayed the same, reserved, steady, waiting. Stand up, Bran barked. Rayn rose smoothly, towering a full head above the soldier. Chains hung at his wrists, but loose enough for him to move. Bran prodded him out of the cage. Sora's heart pounded not with fear, but something deeper she couldn't yet name. Corbin approached with the papers in hand. You're under contract to Miss Lane for the next 6 months, Corbin Hall told Rayn. You work for her. You keep yourself out of trouble. You live where she says. Understood? Rayn didn't answer. His eyes shifted towards Sora Lane. She stepped closer, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. You're free of that cage, she said softly. But only if you choose it. A small, unmistakable flicker moved through his dark eyes. Sora drew a steady breath. You don't have to come with me. You can walk away right now. I won't call the soldiers. I won't chase you. I signed your papers only because no one else would. She felt as fragile as the herb she hung to dry in her shop. When Rayn finally spoke, his voice was low, rough from silence. You do not know me. No, she admitted. But I've seen enough to know you deserve a chance. She studied him, searching his face. If you want to go, go. But if you want a place to stay for a while, until you find your own road, you can walk with me. Rayn's gaze held hers longer than it had in the yard the day before. Long enough to make her breath tighten. Long enough to make her feel seen, truly seen, for the first time in years. At last he said, I will walk with you. Relief washed through her, so fast she nearly stumbled. They turned and walked out of the square together. Rayn moved beside her, silent, measured, steady. His wrists were still bound, and Sora halted. Sheriff, she said, the chains. Corbin Hall frowned. If he runs, he won't, Sora said firmly. Something in her voice must have convinced him. Corbin hesitated, then motioned for Bran. The chains were unlocked. For a moment, Rayn stood still, rubbing the raw skin where metal had pressed too long. Freedom, simple and quiet, settled over him like a wool blanket. He didn't smile, but Sora felt something in the air shift. As they followed the road leading out of town, Sora spoke before she lost her nerve. Rayn, if someday I asked you to stay longer than 6 months, or even to consider. She swallowed hard, to consider being part of my life. Would that be impossible? He looked at her, confusion softening into understanding. I do not yet know your reasons, he said, but I will learn. Sora's cheeks warmed, though she kept her eyes forward. They walked deeper into the woods, 2 lives, 2 histories, 1 quiet choice, weaving them together. The trail to Sora's cabin curved between young pines, their needles whispering with the evening breeze. Sunset brushed the valley in soft apricot light. Rayn walked a step behind her, at first quiet, light-footed, almost too still for a man of his build. His eyes took in everything. The bend of the creek, the pale stones, the thin ribbon of smoke drifting from a far-off cabin. Sora felt his silence but didn't mind. She'd always preferred gentle things, the rustle of herbs drying in the rafters, the murmur of wind through grass, the peace of someone who didn't fill the air just to fill it. When her cottage came into view, small, warm, tucked beneath tall pines, Rayn slowed. It was simple, a single-story cabin with a weathered porch, a stone chimney, and a hand-dug well. Behind it stretched her pride, an herb garden laid out in neat rows. She turned to him. "This is home." Rayn gave a single nod, not approval, not hesitation, simply acknowledgement, but something in his eyes softened. Maybe it was the whisper of herbs in the twilight, or the lavender drifting from the open window. "Come," she said gently. "You must be hungry." Inside the cabin smelled of rosemary lamp oil and warm bread. Sora slipped off her shawl and hung it on a carved peg. Rayn paused at the threshold until she nodded for him to enter. He stepped in without a sound. She moved through the kitchen with practiced ease, ladling stew from the pot that had simmered all afternoon. She set a bowl in front of him. Rayn hesitated only a breath. Then he sat. He ate slowly, quietly, as though unused to someone placing food before him. Sora didn't press him with questions. She simply offered bread and watched the tension ease from his shoulders, a little more with each bite. After supper, she led him to the small room off the hallway. "It isn't much," she said, "but it's clean and it's yours as long as you need." Rayn stepped inside. A narrow cot, a small dresser, a window facing the herb garden. The faint scent of sage bundles lingered in the air. "It is good," he said. That was all, but it warmed Sora's chest more than she expected. The next morning began softly. Pale sunlight sifted through the trees. Sora stepped outside to find Rayn already by the porch, kneeling beside the boards and fixing the loose plank she had ignored for months. "You're up early," Sora Lane said, surprised. Rayn didn't lift his head. "I heard the wood complain." He tapped the loose board with his knuckle. It asked to be mended. Sora blinked, unsure whether he was teasing or simply speaking with that quiet, poetic manner she'd heard from some Apache elders. Rayn's face didn't reveal either way. "Thank you," she said sincerely. He gave a single nod and returned to his work. Later that morning, Sora tended her herb garden. Kneeling among lavender and chamomile, she felt the warm earth press into her palms. Rayn approached with silent steps, stopping at a respectful distance. "You grow many medicines here," he observed. "Yes," she said. "People in town come for teas and salves. Some for comfort, some for sleep, some just for a bit of company." She brushed soil from her hands. "Would you like to learn?" Rayn crouched beside her, his movements smooth as water. "I learned some from my grandmother Ayani," he said. "But your plants, they smell different." Sora smiled. "Then we'll teach each other." They worked side by side until mid-afternoon, harvesting mint, tying thyme bundles, checking comfrey roots. Rayn's hands were steady, surprisingly gentle for a man built with such strength. He handled each stem as though it held a living spirit deserving care. "Your hands surprise me," Sora said lightly. A faint spark warmed his eyes. "My people teach that all living things have spirit. You touch spirit the same way you touch earth." It was the longest thing he'd said since coming to her home, and Sora felt something shift inside her. Something she didn't dare name yet. That evening, Sora walked into town for supplies, leaving Rayn to chop wood. When she returned, the woodpile was neatly stacked, each log split clean. Rayn waited near the porch arms, loosely folded, watching shadows stretch across the valley. "You work hard," she said. "My hands need purpose," he answered, "and yours find it easily." They stood together in the falling dusk without speaking. The quiet settled between them, naturally comfortable, unforced, like two people who didn't need words to share the same moment. Then a voice carried from the path. "Evenin' Sora. Evenin' Rayn." Veil Rider strode forward, waving broadly. His smile was too bright, too eager. He tipped his hat toward her, then toward Rayn with a friendliness so forced it rang hollow. "Just checkin' how you two are settlin' in," Veil said. "Town's been talkin'." "Folks do worry." Sora bristled. "There's nothing to worry about." Veil nodded, though his gaze lingered on Rayn. "Sure. Just making sure he ain't trouble." Rayn said nothing, but Sora felt the tension rise beside her, a quiet tightening, sharp as a drawn bowstring. "Veil," she said firmly. "Rayn has been nothing but respectful. You don't need to check on us." Veil looked startled, his grin faltering. "Well, I'll leave it at that." He tipped his hat again, more awkward this time, and trudged down the path. When he was gone, Sora released a slow breath. Rayn's voice came low behind her. "He does not like me. It doesn't matter what he likes," she said softly. "I decide who I trust." A stillness settled between them, warm instead of uncomfortable. "Why do you trust me, Rayn?" asked at last. Sora looked toward the fading light over Willow Valley, remembering the way his eyes had held hers through the bars, calm and steady, recognizing something in her no one else had seen. "Because," she said slowly, "I know what it feels like to be seen as something you're not." Rayn's expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable, as though a weight had eased just slightly from his shoulders. That night, as Sora brewed tea and Rayn tended the small fire in the hearth, the cottage felt changed. Not entirely hers, not yet his, but something shared, something forming quietly between them. And though neither spoke it aloud, both felt the same truth settle softly into the room. This place was changing, and so were they. Autumn deepened in Willow Valley, like a long sigh after years of held breath. The hills turned gold first, then the lower forest, until every aspen glowed like a slender pillar of sunlight. Sora had always loved this season, but this year felt different, richer, warmer, as though the valley itself had grown a second heartbeat. Rayn rose earlier than she did most mornings, stepping outside before dawn to greet the quiet. He would stand for a moment, palms lifted toward the coming light, before chopping wood or checking the snare lines he set only for small game. Sora had stopped pretending she didn't watch him from the window. He moved with a calm strength she rarely saw in men, yet carried no arrogance with it. In the herb garden, he treated each plant with the same careful reverence, whether a fragile chamomile sprig or a stubborn sage patch. In town, he lowered his gaze slightly, beside her, guarding her from unwelcome stares. And the town did stare, but Sora no longer cared. One crisp morning, she stepped outside to find Rayn waiting by the porch with 2 small satchels. "I will gather plants today," Rayn said. "Aspen bark, red willow, and the tall blue flower you showed me." "Lungwort," Sora Lane corrected gently. "But it only grows on the northern slope." He nodded once. "Will you walk with me?" Her heart fluttered like a startled bird at the simplicity of the question. "Yes," she said. The trail rose gradually through the forest sunlight, fluttering through shifting branches. Squirrels darted over fallen logs, and the air tasted of pine resin and cool earth. Sora walked beside Rayn, matching his steady stride. "You know these woods well," he said. "I've lived here most of my life," she replied. "The plants taught me to pay attention." Rayn glanced at her, a soft warmth settling in his dark eyes. "You listen like someone who understands quiet." Color climbed her cheeks. "And you listen like someone who belongs to the quiet." He didn't deny it. When they reached the northern ridge, the aspen trees shimmered in the wind, thousands of silver-green leaves whispering like tiny bells. Sora brushed her fingers along a pale trunk. "These trees shed their bark in layers," she said. "They heal from the inside." Rayn studied the tall grove. "Ayani told me the aspen remembers everything. Even when old trees fall, new ones rise from the same roots." Sora smiled softly. "Roots matter more than people think." Rayn looked at her, truly looked. Yes, he said quietly. They do. They spent hours collecting herbs. Rayn dug for roots with careful hands, placing them gently into Sora's satchel. Sora climbed the ridge to cut fresh strips of aspen bark. Their hands brushed once accidental, quick, but enough to steal Sora's breath. By midday, they rested on a fallen log, eating cornbread and dried apples. A soft breeze lifted Sora's hair. Rayn watched the valley spread below them, the golden aspens glowing like a sea of lanterns. This place, he murmured, it is peaceful, different from where I lived. But the land still speaks. What does it say to you? Sora asked. He considered a moment. It says, I am not unwelcome here. Her heartbeat stumbled. I'm glad, she whispered. Rayn's gaze returned to her steady, calm searching. Something warm shifted in the air between them. Sora looked away, only because the feeling was too immense to hold. Silence settled gentle as falling leaves. Then Rayn spoke again, voice lower. Your home. It has changed me. Sora tightened her grip on her satchel. How I sleep, he said simply. I eat food made with care. I work with my hands, not in fear. A pause. And you? He searched for the words. You speak to me as if I am a man, not a threat, not a burden. Her eyes stung with unexpected emotion. Because you are a man, Rayn. He looked at her slowly, as if each second mattered. You see me not what others say I am. Sora swallowed hard. I wish more people saw what I see. What is that? He asked quietly. She opened her mouth, but couldn't answer, not yet. The truth felt too tender, too new. They descended the ridge while afternoon light melted into amber. The wind cooled, brushing them with the first hint of winter. Near the foot of the trail, Sora stopped, gathering her courage. Rayn, she said. He paused beside her, attentive. When your contract with me ends, you'll be free to go anywhere. She stared down at her hands. And when that time comes, you might leave. Rayn's voice was calm. Do you wish me to leave? The question cut sharp and sudden. No, Sora whispered. I don't. Rayn stepped closer, his presence warm and solid the way a hearth feels when you come in from the cold. Sora, he said softly. Why does the thought trouble you? Her chest tightened with words she had been burying for weeks. Because I don't want to lose what we found here. The peace. The work. Her voice broke slightly. You. A long, gentle silence followed. Aspen leaves whispered above them. Rayn reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away. When she didn't, he placed his hand lightly over hers. His palm was warm, steady, rough from labor, yet tender in the way it settled against her skin. You will not lose me, he said. Sora's breath caught. He lifted her chin gently with 2 fingers, the motion delicate as a breath. His eyes had darkened with sincerity, searching her soul with a depth she hadn't realized she longed for. You once asked, he murmured, if I could stay in your life. Maybe even as more than a helper. His voice dropped lower. I did not understand then. Now I do. Sora Lane felt tears blur the golden forest around them. Rayn brushed his thumb across her cheek, soft as wind. I choose you, Sora, he said. Not because I owe you, not because of any contract, but because my heart knows where it belongs. Before she could speak, before doubt could return, Rayn leaned in and pressed his lips gently against hers. The kiss tasted of autumn wind and quiet promise. When they finally parted, Sora rested her forehead against his chest, her heart trembling, not with fear, but with a certainty, warm as sunlight. Beneath the whispering aspens, 2 separate lives finally began to entwine. Winter settled over Willow Valley with a softness that surprised Sora each morning. Frost painted silver patterns along the window panes, and the creek behind the cottage sang in a deeper, slower voice as ice gathered along its edges. Blue smoke curled from the chimney, warm, steady, constant. Inside life shifted not loudly, but with the quiet assurance of roots growing beneath snow. Rayn split wood before sunrise each morning, stacking each log neatly beside the porch. Sora brewed tea from spruce tips and rose hips, the fragrance drifting through the cottage and mingling with the warmth of the fire Rayn tended. Their movements around each other had become natural, a gentle dance through daily tasks without hurry or strain. Sometimes that peace frightened Sora in its simplicity. She wasn't used to steadiness. She wasn't used to waking at night and hearing another breath in the room beside hers, a breath she now listened to with ease rather than fear. She wasn't used to someone caring that her hands were cracked from wind, or that she forgot to eat when she buried herself in her medicines. And Rayn wasn't used to lowering his guard, yet he did. And every day Sora saw proof of it, a small piece at a time. One cold morning in early January, as Sora crushed dried mint leaves, Rayn stepped into the kitchen carrying a small wooden carving. He placed it carefully on the table in front of her. "For you," he said quietly. She looked down. It was a tiny pendant carved from juniper wood. A hummingbird in mid-flight, wings curved gracefully. It hung from a slender braid of soft leather. "Oh, Rayn." Her voice wavered. "It's beautiful." He nodded once. "In my people's stories, the hummingbird finds sweetness even in harsh places. It brings joy and light and hope." His eyes softened. "It reminds me of you." Her breath caught. No one had ever given her something so thoughtful, something shaped by hand, something meaningful, something that felt nearly timeless. She touched the pendant gently. "May I wear it always?" he murmured. She tied it around her neck. The wood felt warm against her skin, and when she looked up, the way Rayn watched her, quiet, reverent, made her pulse flutter. As winter deepened, the townsfolk slowly grew accustomed to seeing them together. Though whispers followed, they softened with time. Nessa Wild visited one afternoon, carrying a basket of sewing supplies, pretending she simply happened to be nearby. She eyed Rayn curiously. But when he offered to carry her basket, she nodded approvingly. "You mind your manners better than half the men in town," she said. Rayn inclined his head. "Respect returns where it is given." Nessa hummed, impressed. Even Vale Rider eventually swallowed his pride. One snowy evening, Sora found him waiting on the path, his hands shoved awkwardly in his coat pockets. "Just wanted to say," he muttered, staring at anything but Rayn. "You two seem settled." Sora smiled gently. "We are," Vale nodded, kicked at the snow, then glanced at Rayn. "I was wrong about you." Rayn's answer was simple. "People learn when they choose to." Vale let out a stiff laugh. "Suppose I deserved that." He tipped his hat and walked off. As Sora watched him disappear into the dusk, something warm unfurled in her chest. The valley was changing slowly, quietly, but changing, and she and Rayn were part of that change. Spring drifted into Willow Valley, melting snow, waking the earth. The herb garden stretched towards sunlight, filled with new seedlings she and Rayn planted together. Their days grew longer, filled with shared chores and laughter that flowed easier between them now. One evening in late April, Rayn found Sora sitting on the porch steps, watching the creek shimmer pale gold in the sinking sun. She looked lost in thought. "You are quiet tonight," Rayn said, settling beside her. "I was thinking." Sora Lane hesitated, twisting the little hummingbird pendant gently between her fingers. "It's been almost 6 months." Rayn understood instantly the contract. He nodded. "Yes." He reached out and covered her hand with his. "Sora, do you wish our time to end never?" The word escaped her before she could soften it. A slow, warm smile touched Rayn's mouth, the kind of smile a man gives only once he knows he is safe. "Nor do I," he said. Sora let out a trembling breath. "I worried that if I said something first, it might sound like I was asking out of obligation." "Obligation?" Rayn shook his head gently. "I chose to stay months ago. I chose you." Emotion tightened her throat. Rayn rose step before her and extended his hand. "Walk with me." She placed her hand in his, and together they wandered toward the aspens lining the edge of their land. The breeze carried the scent of thawing earth. Birds trilled overhead, and the world felt freshly made. When they reached the grove, the same grove where they had first spoken their truths, Rayn turned to her, his expression solemn yet overflowing with warmth. "In my people's way," he said softly, "a union is not made with many words. It is kept with promises, honored with lives, joined with hearts that do not turn away." Sora's pulse thundered in her ears. Rayn took her hands in his. "I want to share my path with you, Sora Lane, not for a season, but for as long as our feet walk this earth." Tears slid down her cheeks, warm, joyful, overwhelming. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Rayn. I want that more than anything." He lifted her hands to his lips, brushing them with a reverence that stole her breath. And when he kissed her beneath the whispering aspens, the world felt steady, sacred right. Their wedding was simple, quiet, and beautiful. Nessa Wild stitched Sora's dress from soft cream cotton. Eldrick carved a ring from river-polished driftwood. Rayn wove one of Ayani's old beads into Sora's hair. And the vows they exchanged beneath the budding aspens were spoken with truth, with humility, with warmth, with the gentle certainty of two souls who had finally found home. In the seasons that followed, their cottage filled with warmth cups of shared tea, quiet laughter beneath lamplight, and small projects built by 4 careful hands instead of 2. People traveled from neighboring towns seeking Sora and Rayn's medicines, her western herbs, and his Apache knowledge, healing bodies and spirits alike. Sometimes on still evenings, Rayn carved tiny pendants for the valley's children. Sora tended her growing herb beds with a joy she had never known. But most often they simply sat on the porch together, watching golden light settle across Willow Valley. Her hand resting in his presence steady as the land itself. In those moments, Sora would think, her heart full to overflowing, "I saved him from a cage. But he freed me in ways I never knew I needed." And Rayn, his arm wrapped around her shoulders, would whisper into her hair, "We found home in each other." All stories are created for entertainment purposes and may include fictional elements or dramatized interpretations inspired by historical settings. We use AI tools, voiceover, visuals, scripts as creative assistants. However, all content is reviewed, refined, and edited by humans to ensure emotional authenticity and storytelling quality. We fully comply with YouTube's policies regarding AI-generated content and do not use any deepfake techniques or misleading recreations of real individuals. All visuals and supporting materials are properly licensed. Sharing, re-uploading, modifying, or distributing any part of this content in any form requires written permission. We appreciate your support and respect for original creative work.